Welcome to Pods with Posh and Pool, a podcast designed to inspire and challenge listeners through story, experience and insight. To face adversity, learn from suffering and discover how to embrace life with a heart filled with love and gratitude. We are so thrilled to have you journey with us and can't wait to share your stories. Join Sue O'Callaghan and Joanne Webb as we disrupt the theory that everyone has perfect lives.
Join us as we talk about forgiveness, why it's important, what the benefits are, and what happens to us if we really can't forgive. So we are third in our series. We first started talking about self-love and how to actually find it. Then we talked about shame and how to piece that apart and the difference between shame and guilt. And today we are talking about forgiveness.
And forgiveness in the dictionary is interpreted as the conscious and deliberate decision to release your feelings of resentment, bitterness and vengeance towards another person or yourself. And interestingly, it's also regardless whether they deserve forgiveness or not.
And I think that's the really important point, isn't it? Because when you talk about forgiveness, it's a beautiful word. The word forgiveness is a beautiful word within itself when you just say it. However, it's not the easiest thing to do. And within all what you've just said there, it's about forgiving others, forgiving yourself. And often we have to forgive when either the issue hasn't been acknowledged or there's no admission of guilt or we don't receive an apology.
And for listeners, that's actually very hard because you and I have been in situations where we have found it very hard to forgive. But interestingly also, forgiveness is the opposite of blame. When we blame, we need a sense of control over the situation. So when we forgive, we're actually taking our power back because we've given our power away to somebody else. It's about being empowered ourselves, isn't it?
Yeah. I love this quote, actually. This is by I can't speak today. Bishop T.D. Jakes. Understand that forgiveness does not exonerate the perpetrator. Forgiveness liberates the victim. It is a gift you give yourself.
Absolutely, because it's the initial understanding of forgiveness one might have is that you're letting somebody else off the hook. And if you're listening and you have been dealt a severe injustice, somebody's really hurt you, the concept of saying you're letting them off the hook is too much to comprehend because you're too raw, aren't you? It's a really difficult one to face. There's a lovely quote that says, not forgiving though is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die.
It's true though, isn't it? And
it's so true.
We just talked about blaming, because if you are in a situation and you have had something done to you, you've been wronged, or sometimes you haven't necessarily been wronged, but you're still blaming another person. And we can tell ourselves stories over and over again. I was actually listening to some research today about when things actually happen to us and they're in our memory. Often 50% of it is actually not even the full truth. Our memory has arrange something in our head to make the story bigger or more embellished anyway, and we're sitting there in blame or in resentment or in bitterness when we can't forgive another person or when we can't forgive ourselves. And it's actually a really mean place to be. You think of those words: bitterness, resentment, anger, rage. They bring you down, don't they?
That's the poison, isn't it? You're drinking the poison and you're assuming the other person's going to be affected by it, but that's not the case at all. And I think blame is the discharging of discomfort and pain, and therefore it denies accountability. So what you're talking about is exaggerating the thoughts about the situation, and that could well be, as you're talking about that, I relate to my divorce and all the blame I put on my ex-husband for the things that he did wrong, and he did those things wrong in my eyes, but also I was not holding myself accountable for the triggers where I was triggering him, where I'd failed in certain situations. I wasn't communicating in a healthy way. I'd entered into an unhealthy relationship knowingly. I had issues that caused me to go into that relationship and be very needy of certain aspects of a relationship that was lacking in my own life. So I was telling myself one side of the story, which is what you're saying. We have an inaccurate representation of the truth. We see it very much from our point of view. But my need to do that was to take control back into my own life and put myself back on a pedestal to say I'm okay, which meant I wasn't dealing with my own crap, basically, at the end of the day.
Yeah. And one of the biggest examples of this is Nelson Mandela. So that man spent 27 years in prison. 27 years, that's a lifetime. And he said, as I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. Now that is so powerful and so poignant. As a man who believed in himself and believed in his country, he left that prison after serving 27 years, and that was an injustice, absolutely. But he walked out the door and he forgave because he did it for himself, because he no longer wanted to be in that prison. That's a metaphor, isn't it? You know, he would have been in the prison, and his mind and his heart and his soul would have really dragged him down. And how brave. And he went on to be the president of South Africa, got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, and went on to continue to help his country fight the battle against AIDS and things like that. And he was so remarkable. We are capable of doing great things, and if we can't forgive, the only person that's really going to affect is us, the person who's carrying all that bitterness, hatred, rage and anger around with them.
Yet what courage that takes, because that takes a mindset to believe that you can do it. And as you say, the metaphor is that we are actually held as prisoners when we don't forgive, and the greatest form of freedom that he achieved was to be released from the physical prison and the emotional psychological prison, which is what we need to do if we want to actually walk into freedom. There's a lovely example. I worked in prison teaching restorative justice. We had 6 sessions, and the third session was always on forgiveness, which was a big one. The prisoners were mainly murderers. They were women, mainly murderers, and they were pretty tough cookies. Their life circumstances were such that they were very resilient. But on the third session, when we taught forgiveness, we had a couple come in, Ray and Vi Donovan, and they'd had their son murdered age 14 on the streets, and he was left for dead, and a car drove over the brow of a hill and caught his belt in the exhaust, dragged him over the road for 400 metres. And the parents had to face this, and they had to face a 15-year-old, a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old murderer. They were given life sentences. But they came to forgive those 3 boys one by one, and one by one they met them. But it was interesting because they talked about facing the death of their son in casualty, in hospital, and they said, all I could feel, Ray said, all I could feel was rage and anger, and it wasn't doing anything, it was just hurting me. And they came to forgive the boys. And then what they did, they turned their life around, and they now go into prison, and they say to the prisoners, have you ever forgiven yourself for the crime that you've committed? And when they teach on the ripple effect of crime, which is that the immediate family are affected, the cousins, the grandparents, the friends, the whole communities are affected. And that carries on for years and years and years, because then you remember the first birthday, the first anniversary of their death, and it goes on and on and on. Every single year you remember. When they understood the ripple effect of crime, then they could actually begin to forgive themselves, because they took ownership. And it is about taking ownership of our own behaviour to forgive.
And forgiveness is really hard. It is a difficult thing to address. We're not saying it's easy. You know, you and I have been in awful situations. So, you know, you had your children abducted. I was in a really abusive relationship, but both you and I have come to forgive them people. And why have we done it? Exactly for why we've been saying it. We've done it for ourselves. We've left those people. We have moved on. We're no longer with them. It's a bit like Nelson Mandela. We don't want to be in the prison of being with those people anymore who did awful things to us. I don't think the things that they did were right. It's not okay. Absolutely not whatsoever. But we forgave for our hearts and for our souls, so we could be lighter and brighter, and we can live our best life.
But it's not an easy journey. I mean, mine was 2003, and it's now 17 years later. And I look back and I think there were levels of forgiveness. I didn't make a conscious decision at the beginning to say, I'm in a situation where my children have been abducted, I will forgive, because I had to rebuild my life and everything about it was broken. But it took many, many years, and I still now, if I get triggered by something, still have to just release and forgive again and again. And I see it as a sort of symbolic chain between me and my ex-husband, and I have to physically cut it with a pair of pliers or, you know, a big rope cutter. But I have to do it again and again and again. But I've healed from many of the parts that destroyed me, the anger and the rage. But it's such a long journey, and, you know, we're going to give a few tips to the listeners about how we forgive. And the first thing really is that there's many different ways. It's not one act. It looks like many different things for different people.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think I managed to get to a place of forgiveness a bit quicker than perhaps I would have if it happened to me 10 years previous. only because the journey that I went on, because within that marriage, which we've documented in podcasts in the past, within that marriage, I managed to find self-love. I did a lot of work on myself, and I've been doing work on myself since I was 18. So it's been this compound effect of trying to work on me and finding out who I was. And I think because I'd got to this place of self-love, and I was very spiritual, and I had higher faith, I didn't find forgiveness in the end that difficult. It wasn't easy, but it didn't take me 17 years. I was really fortunate about that. I mean, I've watched you go through your journey, Sue, as well. We've only known each other a couple of years, and you have come a massive way in your forgiveness journey, I think.
And I think the more you practice forgiveness, like we practice so many different aspects of controlling our thoughts, feelings, emotions, living in positivity rather than negativity, you practice, it becomes easier and easier, and then you live by the routine that you establish for your life, don't you?
Totally.
And I think the biggest thing for me was to stop the story.
Yeah.
I had a story that I was speaking over my life, that I was a single mother, that I was a victim to my circumstances. If this hadn't have happened, I'd be a different person. So I was actually living in the past. But when I stopped the story and said, I'm now living in the present, I'm not going to be a victim to my circumstances. I'm going to rebuild my life and create something better for it. Then I could recreate my future and realise then I was empowered. I wasn't disempowered anymore.
Yeah.
And what was that going to look like for me?
And this is what we try to teach our coaching clients when we're with them. We try to say to them, this is your life. You decide how you live it. And this is all a choice. This is all a choice. And you're right that word is so important. It's empowering. And as soon as you realise you have that choice, and you can either do it or you don't, it's up to you. But how do you want to live your life? Do you want to live it in bitterness, resentment, rage and anger, sorrow, grief? Or do you want to live it in gratitude, thankfulness, being blessed, being able to move forward with love in your heart, being able to care for others, care for yourself? Because you can't when you're in that rage. You can't do all of that. You can't live, it's hard to go transition between the two, isn't it, when you're carrying rage and bitterness?
Absolutely. And as we're giving tips to our listeners, that's a really vital tip, isn't it? You've got the choice between negativity and positivity. And actually you can live in gratitude. You can find the things in your life to be grateful for. And I did get my children back, and it was a struggle. But every day then I could be grateful that I had my children back at home.
Yeah.
And we could rebuild our lives. And again, it's a choice. So we always say the first thing in any situation is to acknowledge what you're feeling. Be aware that you're sitting in unforgiveness. Be aware of what you need to forgive, and also be aware of your feelings that you have when you're sitting in unforgiveness. What does it actually feel like? Keep a diary, write some notes, write down all the feelings that you've got, because it'll be different for different people. It might be confusion, it might be anger, it might be bitterness, it might be rage, it might be throwing things around the room, it might be sitting crying, not getting out of bed in the morning, and depression. Write it down, acknowledge it, and be aware of it is the first stage.
Yeah, acknowledge how you're feeling, and then acknowledge who and what do you need to forgive. Do you need to forgive others for injustices that have happened to you? Do you need to forgive yourself for your part in a story? Do you need to forgive yourself for some behaviours or things that you've done? Do you need to forgive your parents from childhood? Do you need to forgive your partner? Do you need to forgive your best friend? Do you need to forgive your boss? It can be anybody. You can even be forgiving your children. The list is endless, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I do a forgiveness routine every month with the full moon. And with the full moon, I forgive every month. And sometimes I find myself forgiving the same things over and over again until it's properly released. I find that a way of staying on track to remember to forgive, to keep it an ongoing practice. This is what we're saying. It's just acknowledge your thoughts. Who do you need to forgive? And then decide if you actually want to forgive. This is what we go back to. It's your choice. Decide, do you actually want to forgive them? Ask yourself the question. Do you want to live with all the pain and the hurt, or do you want to move forward? It's your choice. And once you've decided, and only if you decide that you want to forgive them, then you actually can.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that because we're all at the end of the day, I think, looking for recognition from another person that what they did was wrong or they hurt you. And you want them to say, sorry, you actually matter. Sorry, I really love you. Or sorry, I care. So we're constantly looking for affirmation. We're looking for recognition. We're looking for love from another person. The minute we do that, we're setting them up to fail, because they can't necessarily do that for us.
Yep.
And you're a really big one on finding self-love. And so at that stage, I would say you need to be able to say to yourself, you matter. you are loved. I care about you, and hold yourself in your pain. In the absence, my ex-husband couldn't do that for me, and never to this day have I ever received an explanation or an apology as to why those children were abducted. That for me is a really big one. It would be so much easier to forgive if he said sorry, if he said these are the reasons I did it, so I could understand it. In the absence of understanding why it happened, in the absence of sorry or any acknowledging of the pain it caused me and the children, I have to say to myself, that's irrelevant. I can recreate my life. I love myself. To me, I say to myself, you matter, and I don't need to look for an explanation. I don't need to look for affirmation from him at all.
Absolutely, because often we don't get it. Like you said, you have never received an apology. And when we did our podcast with the beautiful Jane Weeks, who lost her 3 children in the fire in Doha, we touched on forgiveness, didn't we? And she said she hasn't been able to forgive because she's never received any acknowledgement from the owners of the daycare centre where children were. There's never been any admission of guilt that they should have done things differently. And I totally get that. It's such a huge thing to have to get over. But your thing is then, isn't it, to maybe try to turn to a higher faith and ask them to help you forgive. Yeah. And you always explain that so beautifully.
Well, it's interesting because watching The Crown, the series The Crown, the Queen discovered that Edward VII had been collaborating with Hitler, and as a consequence had given vital information about certain bombings that were going to take place in England. And when the Queen discovered that many of her people had been killed in those bombings, she went to Billy Graham, who had been a confidant to her, and said, I actually cannot forgive him because her people have been killed.
Yep.
What should I do? And he said, in the absence of being able to forgive, ask God to forgive on your behalf. And that's a big thing, isn't it? To know that there's a higher power, higher being, whether you call it the universe, energy, God, Buddha, whatever you want to call it, to give it away and know there's a high purpose for it. And it releases you from, again, the control and needing to hold on to it. Because in many ways, by blaming somebody else, by wanting to hurt them, you are getting revenge. But the avenge that the universe gets is so big, and that's the word karma, isn't it? You know, what you sow, you reap. And actually, we just need to be in integrity ourselves all the time, because we will reap our own harvest for remaining in integrity, remaining in truth, remaining in honour, and not going to get revenge. As hard though it is, I have to say.
No, and I agree. And I think, we've touched on emotions and feelings and other people doing things to us and us looking outward for things that we actually need to give ourselves. We're talking about big things here when we're talking about forgiveness, but actually forgiveness needs to happen daily, hourly, minutely, is that a word? Sometimes, because people are always in our life and things are always happening. And, it might just be that your partner didn't make dinner when they said they were going to, and then you kind of get the huff, and then you don't feel like you're cared for and you're not loved. And all of a sudden you've built up this big, huge story in your head, and maybe they just had a really long day at work or got caught in some traffic. But you've told yourself this story that they don't love you anymore or they're not good enough for you. And then you kind of have to go through almost a little mini forgiveness ceremony for that person and for yourself. Do you know what I mean?
Which is clearly what I had to do last night, because I had a bit of a dumping session on you yesterday, didn't I? And that just shows, though, how we constantly have to blame other people to make our situation better. So I was in a situation, I was feeling overwhelmed at work. I came in, I was feeling frustrated. I did the whole crying thing and I dumped it all on you. It's all your fault because you've done A, B, C, D, and you haven't done E, F, G. And then you took ownership over it beautifully, and I went away and thought about it, and I thought, no, you are responsible for your feelings and emotions, Sue, and you're not to blame, Jo. Actually, you said to me, you're your own worst enemy, and I had to say, you're right, I am my own worst enemy, and I'd done ABC right down to Z wrong. And then I looked at it and I thought, okay, so then I need to change my working habits. But it was so quick to blame you, and Brené Brown does a really good talk, doesn't she, on blame. And spilling a cup of coffee in the morning, and immediately when she speaks to her husband on the phone, it's his fault because he came home late last night. And if she'd got to bed a bit earlier, she wouldn't have had the second cup of coffee, which wouldn't have been spilt. And it's so true. That's what I was doing to you yesterday. And it made me feel better to dump the whole lot on you. And then I went away thinking, gosh, you've received all that negative energy of mine. I own it. I've got to take it back. And you had to forgive, which you did really beautifully, I have to say. So it's a daily thing, isn't it? It's daily. What are the rituals we're setting up for ourselves? Give it to God, give it to the universe, but stay in accountability.
And a really good practice to do, as I say, I work with the moon cycle. You don't have to do it with the moons. You can do it whenever you want. It's really therapeutic. Rituals are really therapeutic. And they've been around for centuries, forever. Write down the list. Write down a list of who you want to forgive and why you want to forgive them. And include yourself on that. And it can be from the small to the big. It can be anything. You can forgive the person at the supermarket for giving you the wrong change. You can forgive the person who cut you up in the car and got road rage. You can forgive your partner for having an affair. You can forgive your children for not behaving very well. It doesn't matter. You can forgive yourself for anything that, if you're not actually treating yourself very nice, forgive yourself for that and then learn new ways. But write it down and then burn the list and let it all just float away. Watch those little bits of paper just float away into the atmosphere and let that forgiveness be released. Breathe it in, breathe it out, let it go.
And doing a physical act is such a powerful form of symbolism to release, isn't it? But then a step further is actually to, as you release the anger, the hurt, the guilt, the feelings of rejection, whatever it is, then actually to replace those feelings and say, what do I want to receive from the universe? I want to receive peace and love and gentleness and integrity, whatever it is you want to receive. I love the quote, to forgive is to set the prisoner free and then discover that the prisoner was you.
It's true. And this is the whole point about forgiveness. You are not doing it for the other person. You are doing it for yourself. If you are sitting there in having feelings about another person, wanting vengeance against them, wanting them to have something bad things happen to them, they don't know that. They're not feeling that. But the world is, the energy is, because we are balls of energy, and you are bringing yourself down and you're wasting your thoughts. Forgive, let it go, and replace all those thoughts with nice thoughts about how you'd like your life to look, like you say.
Yeah, and to forgive is the highest, most beautiful form of love. In return, you will receive untold peace and happiness.
Yeah.
And to sit in peace like Nelson Mandela, the freedom, the peace that he walked in after coming out of prison was such a testimony. And it was mind-blowing, wasn't it? It was an example to the world of... It reminds me of the situation in Rwanda when there was mass massacres in the 80s. We watched it all on TV live. And yet it's the one country in the world where neighbours have got together with neighbours who murdered each other to forgive and walk out forgiveness. And how hard is that? What does that actually look like when you walk it out carrying so much pain?
Yeah. But, look online, look at these stories. There's such a beautiful stories. The one you've just said about the couple that went into prisons and passed on their knowledge of forgiveness. How soul-destroying to have a child taken away from you anyway, but then to be able to forgive and then to be able to teach others the act of forgiveness is such a beautiful, special thing. There is amazing things that happen in this world. There's such miracles, such beauty, such passion and such compassion that they're the things that we should be looking at. They're the things that we should be turning to and getting inspiration from.
Yeah, and Ray and Val went on to actually symbolically adopt those 3 boys as their sons because they realised that they hadn't been parented, they hadn't come from loving families. And so they adopted 3 boys into their family with their other son that was left over. And they became their living memory to Christopher, their son who had died. And I just thought, that is such a powerful act, isn't it? To give hope and to give her home and parents to boys in such brokenness.
Yeah. Strong people forgive, weak people don't. That's generally how it is. The strongest of people can forgive. So, take courage from that. Take that grit and know that you're really strong when you can do that.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to do. But again, as we said earlier, there's no right or wrong method of doing it. There's no right or wrong amount of time to be able to do it. So if you're sitting here listening thinking, gosh, I haven't forgiven or haven't completely forgiven, that's okay. Do it as and when you're ready. And I remember feeling as though I had forgiven my ex-husband and people saying to me, so you need to forgive, and being shocked, thinking, I have forgiven, I have forgiven. But actually then realising it's layers, like an onion, peel off one layer, you forgive a layer and another layer comes up and a deeper wound gets exposed. And actually what it's doing as you forgive is healing those deeper wounds, as we say, to set you free.
And it doesn't just heal you emotionally, it actually heals you physically, because health studies have shown that by forgiveness, by releasing that negative energy within our bodies, actually lowers the risk of heart attack, improves cholesterol levels, often improves our sleep, reduces pain, our blood pressure comes down, levels of anxiety come down, and it reduces stress and depression as well. So it's a good thing all round.
Win-win situation all
Absolutely.
round. Yeah.
So release yourself from that emotional prison.
Come out of the past, look to the future. What kind of future do you want to create in terms of freedom and peace and joy and happiness and love? Come out of the past. You cannot change the past.
No, embrace your dark times, embrace them, stop judging, look at them with love rather than hate.
Mm-hmm. One last quote: no one has the power to make you feel uneasy without your consent if you're unwilling to grant authority to that person. So if somebody's making us feel uneasy, we've given them authority to allow them to do that to us. Take back that authority. Don't allow somebody else to do it to you. Love yourself. Forgive yourself as well.
Yeah.
Move on.
And I'm going to leave the listeners with Nelson Mandela's quote because I think it's really poignant. As I walked out the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison.
Love it.
Thanks so much for being with us today. For us to inspire others to live their magnificently imperfect life, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or on your podcast app. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Pods with Posh and Pool. We can't wait for you to join us on our next episode. Love, light and peace.